So what we're going to learn in this course is basically the processes of project management. The cool thing about it is it works for any kind of project.
Okay.
So if you have a home project, if you have a manufacturing project, if you have an accounting project, this process works for all of those typical or different types of projects. So when we look at this, even though it is a specific process, you can manage it to make it work for your particular project.
Interesting, because I'm very disorganized, so the more management, the better.
All right. Well, let's take a look at our course outline.
Okay.
What we'll be doing is I need to get some basic terms in you and make sure that you understand how we use those terms. But once we do that, then we'll talk about the distinct processes of initiate, and then we'll go through the planning stages, and in particular, we'll talk about planning for time, cost, risk, and communication.
Okay.
Then we'll go through, okay, we've planned it, now what do we do? Now we need to manage it. So we'll talk about different things that you would want to do or utilize in managing the project. And then lastly, probably the one that people do the least is closing the project. There's actual steps to closing a project so that we can use the information in that project for future projects.
Interesting. Okay.
So the first thing that we need to do, Chip, is we need to define what is a project.
Okay.
What's the difference between just project work that we have to do and operational work that we have to do? So let's define project work first.
Okay.
Project work is a temporary endeavor. Believe it or not, it is supposed to end. It's not supposed to go on forever and ever. It has a finite beginning and end to it. Along with that, it should have some sort of outcome. It should have a result or a decision or a product or service that comes out of that project. I always joke around with people that we're in the business of change. So something has to have changed by the time that project is over with. And the other thing associated with a project that we don't have listed here that I tell people is that it always requires resources. And resources could be in the form of money, people, things, buildings, equipment. It could be anything that we have to throw at it in order to get this project done.
Okay, so if I'm in IT and I have a client that wants us to install a new wireless network for them, that would be a project.
That would be a project.
But answering my email is not a project because it has no finite end in sight.
That's exactly right. It will go on forever and ever.
Unfortunately.
So when we talk about operational work is just stuff that you have to do all the time.
A normal day-to-day job.
Normal day-to-day job that will not end. It's really important when we talk about estimating later on that you recognize how much operational work you have and how much operational work the people on your project has, because we need to take that into consideration when we're looking at how long it will take them to do tasks on the project.
Right, so 100% of their time won't be on our project. They still have their normal stuff to do too.
That's exactly right. And we'll talk more about that later.
Okay.
So, temporary endeavor has a finite beginning and ending. It requires resources. We have a specific outcome that comes out of the project. Those are really the three main things that we're looking at when we're talking about a project.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good. So, we talked about operational tasks. Operational tasks are typically things that are just ongoing and repetitive, and they usually produce the same outcome. When you go through your email, you've responded to those individuals, and then you go to the next responses. And it helps you perform day-to-day activities. So if I'm in a manufacturing environment, I may have certain cleaning duties that I may have with the equipment that I'm using, and I have to do that each day in order to maintain that equipment.
Okay.
Now, when we talk about operational task versus project task, notice here in the image that these just are cyclical when we talk about operational task. In project tasks, typically one task leads to another to an end. We are finished with that particular series of tasks. And we'll talk more about that sequencing later.
So we can complete a project, but I'll never complete my email.
That's right. You will always have email.
That's depressing, actually.
Well, it's a means to an end, right?
It is.
Okay, so that leads us to the project life cycle. The project life cycle is that we have a start, which is in initiation. We have to make a decision to do the project.
Okay.
There are lots of different options. Think about, in your IT business, there are multiple projects that you can take on, but you have limited amount of resources. So you have to decide which projects are most beneficial or have the highest return on investment for you and your organization?
True. So I have a whiteboard in my office that has a list of things that we need to do over the next month, but we haven't started those yet.
That's correct. And there probably are some other things that you would like to do, but you have to do the things that you need to do first before the things that you'd like to do.
Right. That's
okay.
True.
So in the initial phase, we make those decisions. What are we going to do exactly? Which projects are we going to take on? And what sort of resources are we going to put towards those projects in order to get them done?
Okay.
Then we have this intermediate phase where we go through the process of planning, and we go through the process of deciding exactly how we are going to accomplish that particular project with the resources that we do have. Because there's a limited amount of resources, whether it's people or money or equipment or time. There's a lot of different limitations that we're going to talk about later. Once we get through an intermediate phase, then we have a final phase where we are checking to make sure that we're accomplishing what we needed to accomplish. We're going through a lot of statistics in this phase. We're looking at, are we on track as far as time? Are we on track as far as the cost and that sort of thing? And then that takes us to the end of the project. So this is sort of an overview of the manageable sequences of how we will go through and manage our project.
Okay.
All right.
That makes sense.
Now, need for a project. Why do we need projects? Well, projects help us get things done. And if we don't organize projects in the way that I'm going to show you, then a lot of times they just keep going on and on and on, and there's no final ending to that particular project.
Yeah, I have that problem with a lot of my projects. I mean, we kind of know what needs to be done, but we kind of assign this person this task and assign this task to this person, and then when they get done with those, we kind of look and see what needs to be done next. And it seems very haphazard and random, and we're never sure when we're going to actually be done.
So that particular issue has to do with not assigning a sense of urgency in the form of deadlines. You have to assign those deadlines so that we have a sense of urgency that we have to get something done by a certain time in order to do the next things that need to get done and reach our goal. When we organize it in the format that we're going to talk about, it will help you get your projects completed in a timely manner, within budget, and meeting your scope. Those are the three main things that we're looking for in a project.
That all sounds really good to me.
All right, good. So we have other external things that affect that, though, right? We have our competitors. We have our changing budgets. We have markets. We have customers. These are all external things that will affect how we put our project together and, unfortunately, how we manage the project. Even though we might have planned it out a certain way, we may have to adjust because of these external considerations.
Okay.
All right?
That makes sense.
Okay. A stakeholder. A stakeholder is somebody who has interest in the project. This is a really important idea for you to grab onto. We'll talk about how we separate out different types of stakeholders and what sort of power they have over us in a project. But for now, we just need to know that a stakeholder is someone who has interest in the outcome. So when we think about your project that you mentioned earlier, the wireless network, who has an interest in the outcome of that?
My vendors, obviously, and then I guess the business owners, the client, and myself.
So when you think about all of those different stakeholders, do they have the same interest or do they have different interests associated with the project?
Oh, no, very different interests.
So, for instance, your technicians, what is their primary interest in your project?
Well, I mean, their primary interest is maybe to get a paycheck. I like to think they also want to do a good job, too.
Sure.
And help the client. But, they're fundamentally working for a paycheck.
That's right. What about your client or customer? What is their primary interest in that project?
Well, the customer wants a better wireless network for their tenants. It's a residential facility. So they want to have a better experience, a better infrastructure, a better facility.
So I would consider that scope. What about the price of that? Do they have a concern in that?
Clients always have a concern about the price, sure.
Sure they do. So different stakeholders will have different interests and responsibilities associated with the project. And it's very important for us to consider that so that we can assign that to our stakeholders in a way that they know what their participation needs to be on the project. Setting expectations. This whole process is all about setting expectations with all of our stakeholders. And if we can do a good job at that, we can really stop a lot of potential problems that projects have before they even start.
Okay.
All right? So, Chip, when we look at all of our different stakeholders, we have most of them represented here that you mentioned. The sponsor is someone, I jokingly say, they're the ones who write the checks.
Right.
So, typically in an organization, this would be an executive who says, we're going to do this and I'm going to back it, and this is where the budget's coming from. In your case with the network, you are more interested in the customer. The customer is the person who's going to write the checks, define the scope, and that sort of thing. Then we have the project manager. That's you. You're going to be the one that is running the project and making sure that all these moving parts are coming together in a way that leads us towards our end goals. Then we have our project team. You mentioned that you have your technicians that are going out and installing and working with the plan in order to get this done. And then we have an entire project management team of, you may have people who are gathering requirements. You may have other people who are helping with customer service questions, and those would be part of your project management team. So these are different types of stakeholders that you might see on a project.
So what about my vendor, and my vendor's providing an outside network consultant to work with us? Where would they fall into this hierarchy?
That's a good question. So technically, I guess they could be part of your project team, but I would actually consider them to be something that is not listed here, which is a SME. A SME is a subject matter expert.
Okay.
And a subject matter expert would be someone or some place that we go. It could be a website, it could be a technical manual, but it's a place that we go to get information. And typically, a subject matter expert shortcuts having to do a lot of research or having to figure out things by ourselves through trial and error, and they help us. We take hold of their knowledge, and they help us get things done a lot quicker.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. What we've learned here is we've learned the basics of what a project is and what it's not. We've also learned about the overall process of running through a project, and we're going to talk about that more in detail. And then we've learned a couple of things like what a project stakeholder is and the different parts of that. You think you're ready to go?
I'm ready to go to the next step.
All right, let's do it.
So, Christina, in the last module, you described me as a project manager, and I don't normally think of myself as a project manager. So what exactly does a project manager do?
Okay, well, that's a good question. A project manager is someone who makes sure that we go through the process of planning a project out along with the people who are going to do the work, the people who are going to, the technicians and the individuals that will install your network in your particular case, and then make sure that they get that done. So there's a distinct process to that we will talk about. So what that involves is scheduling and getting the work done, identifying requirements, establishing objectives, balancing quality, scope, time, and cost, and then addressing stakeholder expectations and concerns that may come up throughout this whole process. So when we talk about management, we are managing a lot of different activities, but you have different hats on depending on what phase you're in this process.
Well, I'm used to wearing a lot of different hats.
Well, and to that point, let's talk a little bit about what a program manager is, because I have a sneaking suspicion that you're really a program manager rather than a project manager.
Okay, so you just call me a project manager. So what's a program manager?
A program manager is basically a project manager on steroids, right? This basically means that you manage multiple projects at the same time, not just one project.
That's very true.
Typically, a program manager is someone who manages a group of related projects. So you're in the IT business, so you would have multiple IT projects going on simultaneously in different stages at any given point in time.
Sure.
So when we talk about a program manager, typically we see program managers in a larger organization as someone who is maybe a department head or somebody who is a manager of an area where they have multiple projects going on at the same time. We would consider them to be a program manager rather than a project manager.
Okay.
Okay.
And it sounds like in my case, some of my projects are very clearly projects. It's work that we're doing for a specific client with a specific goal. But there's other times when we have, an internal project or something that we're doing to improve the organization, or something that we're doing to meet some objective internally.
Sure.
I guess those would also count as projects under my program manager hat.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The other aspect of program management is that when you are managing multiple projects, a lot of times those projects have interdependencies. They have certain things, like you said with your business. You may be running some projects associated with your business as well as client projects. And those projects with your business are related in some way. You want to increase profitability. You want to increase customer base. There's certain goals that your organization has that you are trying to support in order to make sure that your business is healthy.
Okay.
So when we talk about going through the process of program management, the key to this versus what we're getting ready to talk about is they all are related usually by topic. So in your case, all of your IT projects would be under the program management hat. The other option is portfolio management. Portfolio management is where you manage multiple projects. Let's say an HR project, an IT project, a sales project. And all of those projects, while they're in different areas, they all have the common goal of increasing profitability or increasing customer satisfaction or whatever main goals your organization may have for that year or multiple years.
So let me see if I understand this. So a project manager oversees one project with one goal, one objective.
Good.
A program manager oversees multiple projects that are all related with a common objective. And then a portfolio manager oversees a portfolio of programs, so portfolios include programs include projects. It's all one big hierarchy.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And if you're looking at a larger organization, usually a project manager would be a frontline individual, like a frontline supervisor or somebody that has their hands into whatever it is that the project is involving. The program manager is usually a department head. They're usually someone who is a manager over multiple areas, and then a portfolio manager is usually an executive.
So it sounds like just because somebody is a project manager, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the word manager in their title.
That's exactly right.
It could be somebody who's just the project manager for the company Christmas party.
That's exactly right. I like the way you think. All right. So when we talk about portfolio management, the primary thing that we're trying to do with portfolio management is further the company's goals. That is the main goal of portfolio management, is all of the projects that are going on, that we're just not letting those happen without directing them towards company goals. That's the primary goal. Lastly, we need to talk about some project deliverables. So a project deliverable is an output from our management activities. So when we go through the process of talking about when we're getting ready to talk about estimating for time or estimating for cost, when we go through that, the outcome is that we'll have a budget, or the outcome is that we have a timeline. So a deliverable is typically something that is a thing that we have at the end of a series of activities. And deliverables are very important for us to monitor, because that will help us see if we're doing things on time, if we're doing things within scope, and we want to look at deliverables when we measure those things.
Okay.
All right. So to wrap this up, we have distinct process groups, and within these process groups of project management, of initiating, planning, execution, monitoring, controlling, and closing, we have specific activities that a project manager will drive in order to get deliverables, in order to close out the project. So that's how everything is related here. Now, the interesting thing for you is, like I said earlier, you have different hats on as a manager depending on what phase you're in. In planning, you're kind of a facilitator. So you have your facilitator hat on. You're bringing everybody together. You're helping them communicate. You're helping them put together a plan, a project plan that they know that they can accomplish.
Okay.
All right. In execution, you are more of a true manager. You are checking the boxes. Did you get your stuff done? Did you get your activities done? Did you get them done on time? And that kind of thing. So during execution, you have your manager hat on, and you're checking in with people and making sure that they've gotten their activities done on time, within scope, and within budget.
Okay.
Monitoring and controlling, you take off that manager hat and you become an analyst, basically. You're looking at all the numbers. You have collected those during execution, and you're saying, hey, are we doing a good job, or do I need to make adjustments because I'm seeing some deviations from the plan?
So are we meeting our timeline? Are we meeting our budget? Are we on track?
That's exactly right. And then lastly, in closing, this is when you wrap everything up, and this is when you produce the reports that say, hey, these are the things that we did well, and these are the things that we probably need to work on going forward. And you gather all the artifacts that we put together through this process so that we can put them in a format where we can use them again and shorten some of this planning time so that we can get a head start for future projects.
So next time we do a project like this, it might be easier.
That's exactly right. That's what we're going for. In general, I tell people that planning should be approximately 20 to 30% of your overall project time. Now, when you get much past 5 years, big projects, or much less than, I would say, 6 months, then those numbers deviate somewhat. So we're talking about projects usually within 6 months to 5 years. About 30% should be spent in planning, but you can shorten that to the 20% by reusing your artifacts and utilizing the lessons learned that we gather up in closing for future projects so that you don't have to spend as much time doing that.
So changing from 30% to 20%, that's a pretty big jump.
That is the reason why we go through closing and why I encourage people to make sure that you go through that last process, because it's probably the one that is either not done well or not done at all because of all the other projects that are going on. It's important.
Gotcha. So this is a lot more structured than what I've been doing, but it sounds like it'll make me a lot more organized and a lot more efficient.
It will. I think you're going to like it.
So, Christina, like we talked about, this whole project management thing is very new for me. I'm used to more doing my job and just doing what I do. What sort of skills do I need to have as a project manager?
That's a good question. So being a project manager really encompasses a lot of different skills. And what I usually tell people when we talk about the different skills is don't panic if you don't have particular skills that are needed in project management. Just recognize it. I think it's very important for project managers to know what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are, because the great thing about being a project manager is that you gather a team around you. And when you are gathering that team around you, you should be smart about it and make sure that you get people on your team that shore up your weaknesses as a project manager.
That makes sense. So get people that are complementary to my own skills.
That's exactly right. I don't want to hire a bunch of me's on a project team. I want a bunch of not me's, because I've got me covered, right? I know what I know and how to do certain things, but there's certain things that I'm not good at. For instance, detail oriented. When I'm looking at spreadsheets and looking at or editing, I know that detail oriented aspect is something that I struggle with. And so I want to make sure that if we're going to use that on a project, that I need to get somebody else that is very detailed oriented on the project team to help shore up that weakness that I may have as a project manager.
I'm the same way. Totally understand.
So, skills of a project manager. You have to have some project management knowledge, which we're covering here, so that's a learned trait. And also knowledge of the application area. So, I'm a contract project manager, and really my expertise is in this process. So, when I go into different places, like when I go into an airplane factory, I don't know how to make airplanes. I have to make sure that there's people on my team that know that, so that we can plug that into the process. So knowledge of the application area is helpful for the project manager, but if that's, like in my case, if that's something that I won't know because I go to all different types of places, then you'll need to have that on the team. Understanding the project environment. What are the things that are going to be easy about running the project in the environment that you're in, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, or the things that are going to be hard, which is more important? You know, is there a lot of red tape? Is there a manager that doesn't want you to do this project and might push back? You know, what are some of the things that you're going to be up against in the environment where you're going to do the project?
And it sounds like this would be where understanding your stakeholders comes in as well?
Absolutely. Making sure that you understand not only what their requirements are and their understanding of the scope of the project is, but also what thoughts and feelings they might have about the project will help you a lot in this particular arena.
Knowing what's important to them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. General management knowledge and skills, so you do need some management skills. You need to know how to set deadlines, ask for activities to be done, helping people get skills in order to get those activities done if they don't have those already, assessing people for those skills. Those would all be general management skills that are needed as a project manager. And then interpersonal skills. So what's interesting about this is I see lots of really good project managers, and usually they're very technical and they know a lot about the business, they know a lot about the environment, they're SMEs in their own right, but then their interpersonal skills are not that great. As far as bringing people together, getting them to talk to each other, working through conflict management. You will always have conflicts on a project. If you don't, then there's a problem, quite frankly. Different interpersonal skills as far as bringing people together and working towards an end is very important as a project manager as well.
Okay.
All right, so those are some basic skills. Once again, when you look at this list, Chip, what I really want you to pay attention to is what am I not very good at? And that's something you either need to shore up yourself by learning more about that, or making sure that you have somebody on your project team that is stellar in that.
Yeah, so for me, my interpersonal skills aren't the best, so I want to have somebody that's good at that. And I don't have any project management knowledge, so I'm here taking this course.
That's right. So you're working on two of those things. All right, so let's talk about the organizational structures, because that really comes from knowing your environment that you're doing the project in. Different organizational structures give power to a project manager differently. So you need to know where your power comes from. And what I mean by power is how can you get things done in an organization, and how can you work that organization in order to get resources, in order to get people, in order to get money, and that kind of thing. So let's talk about the different types of organizational structures. When we talk about how organizations are structured, your traditional type of structure is called functional. That means that we have departments, those departments have department heads, they go to an executive committee or board members, and then that's the basic structure of the organization.
Okay.
Typically, when we do projects in a functional organization, you typically do projects within a department. You usually don't do cross-departmental projects. They're within a department.
So everybody has a role that's kind of described by their function in the company.
That's exactly right, yes. Now, you also have the complete opposite of that is project ties. Project ties would be a good example is construction. Construction is we're going to build this building, and as the project manager, I have complete control over that within my constraints, within time, cost, and scope, and that sort of thing. So I have the ability to manage how that building is going to get built completely, and I don't really report to anybody other than the bank or whoever's supplying, resources in order to get this done.
Okay.
So project ties, the benefit to project ties is that you have complete power over how your project gets done. The negative of it, typically, and we jokingly call it no home, is that when a project's done, you don't have regular work to do because you only work on project work. So you don't have that operational work to fall back on as a job, and you could be out of work until the next project comes.
I see. So the project management structure in a projectized plan would be completely outside the normal hierarchy of the company.
That's right.
And maybe outside people, or maybe people in different roles altogether.
That's right, yeah. Now, a matrix tries to blend functional and project ties. What matrix does is it says, okay, functional, which one of the negatives of functional is that people get real siloed in their thinking. They start to think, well, my department is the only thing that I care about, maybe not the organization as a whole. And because of the natural checks and balances within an organization, like maybe between accounting and sales or what have you, that there tends to be some infighting, so to speak, in a functional organization. Well, what Matrix tries to do is say, hey, you know what? We're going to take this setup that we have for functional, but we're also going to have projects that are cross-departmental. IT is a good example of that. You may work with sales and accounting and an operational group in order to bring them together and provide a system where they can all pull information that they all might need out of the same system.
That makes sense. And I think in IT, we probably do more of that than some other areas would do.
I think so too. I would say IT and HR, because they're support functions of an organization, I would say that those two departments tend to be cross-departmental more and lean towards more of this matrix environment.
We span the whole organization by default anyway.
That's exactly right. So the problem with matrix, we talked about the problem with functional is that it's siloed. The problem with projectized is you don't have a home to go to. You don't have regular work to go home to when it's done. But the problem with matrix that we have to watch out for is that people will tend to have multiple bosses. As a project manager, I will want them to report to me, but then they have a departmental manager that they have to report to, and so we might fight for that resource. We might, if we don't really foster the relationship between the two managers, we might see some conflict there. And unfortunately, the result of that is that the resources are conflicted on what they should do.
That makes sense.
Now, the last one is called composite, and composite is a mixture of all three of those. Typically, you will see a composite in larger organizations where you have a functional setup, but you have specific projectized, especially if they have a manufacturing area or division. You have projectized aspects of projects, and then you have cross-departmental projects as well. So if you have all three of those going on within the organization, we call that a composite organization.
So you mentioned the downside to functional is it gets siloed. The downside to projectized is it may be temporary. The downside to matrix is multiple bosses. What's the downside to composite?
Well, composite, because it is all three of those things together, it's a composite of all three of those things, it would pull all three of those downsides.
So you have all the problems.
So you have all the problems. But, really, when you look at it, the reason why we put these into these type organizational structures is because we want to be aware of what do we have to work with here. We want to know where our power comes from. So understanding what the downside is actually a good thing, believe it or not, because then we can put things in place in order to avoid those issues that might come up. So with composite, especially if I am a program or portfolio manager, I would want to make sure that I have things in place to counteract some of the negatives of matrix, projectized, or functional type project areas.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. A PMO is a project management office, and a project management office really could be just a lot of different things. It could be anything from a website that we go to pull templates and information off of, all the way to the other end of the gamut would be an area where we submit, we need a project manager and this is what we need it for, and then they will give us the project manager, but they manage that project manager. So there's really a wide swath on what a PMO can do. Why do we care about a PMO? Is it helps us get organized. It helps us understand that we do have a lot of projects going on in our organization, and we want to get a handle on how we manage those projects. And so a PMO is a great area. Usually it starts off kind of small and it grows from there. But a PMO is a great area for us to at least house our tacit knowledge so that multiple people can get that and they're not having to figure it out for themselves. So I would say any tribal knowledge that we have in our organization on how to get things done, any templates that we have, maybe even a mentor program where we have project managers that have a lot of experience helping new project managers and mentoring them. Those would be some different things that a project management office would do for us.
So it sounds like that's something that I could see in a larger organization. Does a project manager always report to a PMO?
No, they don't. Like I said earlier when we were talking about a functional environment, a lot of times the project manager will just report to a department head. Okay. And they're doing projects within their particular department. Typically, a project management office evolves when we recognize that we're either having problems or issues, or we are having information come out of projects that we want to harness. Those are usually the two reasons why we put a project management office together.
Well, and it seems like with all the opportunities for efficiency and organization involved, that having a project management office or working towards a project management office would just be a good idea for most businesses.
That's right. And usually when I'm working with an organization, I bring all the project managers together and I have them put a project plan together for what do we need in a project management office, and I have them run that over a year, and they actually compile a project management office themselves to help them get their projects done. And because the people who are going to use it are putting it together, it usually is a successful endeavor. Unfortunately, a lot of times I see, because it's a popular thing to do in project management, that we'll say, okay, we're doing a project management office, and we slap one up and then it just sits there, or nothing really occurs, or it becomes this sort of waste area for effort. And so, there is a lot of opportunity with a project management office to put that together, but it has to be done thoughtfully.
That makes sense.
All right, IT projects. So I know you're in IT.
That'd be me.
And we wanted to have a nod here to IT projects because they differ a little bit from other projects in the respect that the deliverable is intangible. You can't really get your hands on it. You can't touch it and throw it around or push it or drive it or whatever the case may be. So when you have an intangible output, then it really takes a little bit more to help people understand or help the business understand on what the benefits of the outcome might be. So in your particular case, on your project, you were going to work with a network. Well, but how are people going to know that what you've done is a good thing? Can they see it? Can they touch it? How will they know?
Pieces of it, but no, you're right. I mean, the outcome would be people being able to communicate better, people being able to communicate faster, people being able to communicate in areas where they couldn't before. But those are kind of squishy. They're not as tangible as saying we're going to build this wall that's going to be this long and this high.
That's exactly right. So when we talk about IT projects, managing IT projects can be a little bit more difficult because a lot of the requirements we are gathering from within IT rather than from our customers, so to speak. We may have some, complaints, let's say, like, oh, it's too slow, or we can't get to this, or we can't get to that. But they don't know how to articulate exactly what they want. They can't tell you exactly how fast they want it to be or what the conduit would be for that. And so with IT projects, it takes a little bit different management in order to make sure that we're putting together the requirements for a project in a way that we're fulfilling what the customer actually needs.
That makes sense. So usually the customer would request their desired outcome in terms of, we want to be able to access this data, we want to be able to organize this information, we want to be able to access this network, and then we have to put together what the deliverable is going to actually be to achieve that outcome.
That's exactly right. And the scary part is you need to be able to articulate that to your customer. And so in a lot of cases, and engineering is very similar to this, IT, any technical or specialty field, to be able to articulate what you do to a person who doesn't do that sometimes can be difficult. And so we have to keep that in mind, that when we are articulating, this is what we're going to do for you, to remember that we need to say it in a way that they will understand.
Right. We don't want to build the wrong thing.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it just takes a little bit more communication in these types of projects. So one of the things that we might use for communication is what I call a PMIS, a project management software. In this particular case, we're showing Microsoft Project. Microsoft Project's a great software, but there's a lot to it, and a lot of people don't really realize how big it is. It's not just Excel on steroids. It's got a little bit of Access in it, and it's got a little bit of other things in it. But whether you use Project or some other software, there's all kinds of different software out there. Typically in construction, people use Primavera, and there's other online software, e-projects or what have you. But the idea is that we need to capture this information somewhere. So when we are gathering our requirements, when we are gathering information associated with work and how we're going to get that work done, we have to put it in an area that people can access to so that it's a central location going forward when we're actually accomplishing our project.
So we're all on the same page.
That's exactly right. All right, so guidelines for identifying the role of a project manager. So you said, hey, well, what are some things, some skills that I need to have? You have to be able to, bring together knowledge and put it in a formal project management plan. So that's one thing that I'm going to teach you in this class.
Great.
You have to be able to take that plan and do it. So you have to apply your knowledge and manage any technical aspects of it so that the outcomes or the deliverables occur when they're supposed to occur, how they're supposed to occur, by whom they're supposed to occur. All of these things need to stay in place. You have to understand what your environment is, that the project, is it stable? Is it not stable? Is there a lot of impetus for change? We have to know that going into it so that we can manage that. And apply your interpersonal skills and then be able to take on responsibilities and help people get where they need to be on the project. So these are all different aspects of a project manager. It's a little scary looking at that list, right? I mean, that's a lot. But once again, I think that most people can say, hey, you know what? I'm good at the first, second, and fourth one of those, but the other ones I might need to work on. And that's okay. I think the key is knowing what you need to work on and not just saying, hey, well, I'm not going to worry about that. Making sure that you shore up those weaknesses on your project team is really the key to being a good project manager.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I want to be a good project manager, but I know I'm never going to have all of those skills or not be as strong in those areas as I'd like to be. So knowing that I can make sure I have those skills elsewhere on the team is a big benefit.
I think you're going to be all right, Chip.
Okay. Okay, Christina, so now I kind of understand what a project manager is, but how do we actually start a project?
Okay, well, the beginning starts with a charter. So a charter is a document that is broad enough to where it doesn't change over the life of the project. So it's not super detailed. We'll get to the details later, but we've got to start kind of big and make sure that we get the general idea documented. Typically, a charter is issued by the sponsor.
Okay.
Not the project manager, which sometimes doesn't happen in the real world. It's issued by the sponsor that says, hey, you're the project manager, these are the parameters you have to work in, and this is the output that I want. So typically there's some attributes in there such as time constraints, budget constraints, resource constraints. Those are usually articulated in a charter.
So the charter is kind of the big picture of the project?
That's right. It's the big picture of the project. It's the starting point, right?
Okay.
The starting point. So a charter can be as simple as this, where we have a problem or opportunity statement. We assign the project leader, maybe put information about the project approach. Typically, I will put some sort of what I call elevator introduction to the project, some sort of description, usually 5 or less sentences. And then we will go in through the process and say, okay, you have this for the budget, you have this for resources, and I'd like it done on this particular date, because that's going to help us make good decisions over the life of the project.
Okay.
So it starts with a charter, then we take that charter and we develop it into a scope, and then as we're developing into the scope, we bring in our project team and we ferret out a few other things like communication plan, risk, and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So if we look at a scope statement is more detailed. And really, what a scope statement is it's a charter, but we add more detail in the form of requirements.
So is the scope statement something that the project manager would draft?
So the scope statement, it depends on how big the project team is. I've been on projects where I have business analysts that help document the scope statement, and then I've been on projects where, I do everything, where I'm, doing the charter, the scope statement, all the documentation and everything. It just depends on what the scope of the project is. If it's really big, typically you have a staff that will help you put this together.
Okay.
So when we talk about a scope statement, and let me show you an example of this. What we'll put in a scope statement is the general project description. We'll pull that from the charter, and then we'll put objectives in here. So we'll break out our project by objectives. The old adage, how do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time?
One bite at a time. So when you have a really large project or even a smaller project, we need to break it out into objectives and then plan for those objectives so that it's something that's manageable to us. It's not so big that it's this lumbering thing that we're just trying to hit or miss and try to get towards. We want to have a direct path from start to finish, and we start by breaking it out into objectives.
So we don't just have one deliverable and one deadline. We have many steps along the way.
That's right. And that makes it more manageable for everybody and more measurable as well. So that's another good thing. When we talk about putting together requirements, usually that's not something that I will draft. It's something that I gather, or a business analyst will gather from our customers or our stakeholders.
Okay.
So think about your project for a minute. Who would you gather requirements from?
Well, my customer, obviously.
Right?
There may be some from my vendor. I guess there could be some from my technicians.
Sure. So you have different areas that you'll gather requirements. Usually what I do is I will put requirements in this template that I use. And so basically I'll put in here who authored it, when was it registered, and then I have some requirements. And the last project that I did was actually an IT project. So I put in, is this a system requirement? Is it a user requirement? Or is it a business requirement?
Okay.
Sometimes those conflict and we have to work those out, but you need to document all of the requirements.
Okay.
You could have hundreds, if not thousands, of requirements, but you have to document them all so that you can manage to what you have the ability to do within your constraints.
So if you have thousands of requirements, do you ever have a project where you can't achieve all the requirements because they conflict?
Absolutely. So what we have to do is we have to say, well, gosh, you want this wireless network, but you want all these bells and whistles, but your budget does not allow for that. And let me show you why. This particular requirement costs this, or this particular thing requires these people and they cost that. And so you show people what you can do, or more often than not, I don't tell them no, I just say, here are your options. With your constraints of time, cost, and resources, here's your options. You pick what you think is going to be best for your business.
And that sounds like that's a conversation we'd have here while we're determining the scope of the project?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's better to determine that now so that we can set expectations rather than give them something at the end and then say, well, that's not what I expected. That's the ultimate nightmare for a service provider, right?
Sure, you spend all this time building something and it's not what the client wanted.
That's exactly right. So I would rather handle that from the beginning. I gather all the requirements and then manage to what we can do associated with the constraints.
Okay.
So here we would put the actual requirement itself. Who is going to own that? Who's going to make sure that that gets done? Who's going to be the person to either execute or follow up and make sure that that gets done? That would be the requirements owner. And then we'll talk about a work breakdown structure in a later module, but that is the list of what work actually is getting done. And so I want to directly link that to the requirement.
Okay.
Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to control the scope along with time and cost. These three things are known as the triple constraint. Time, cost, and scope together, notice that in the triangle they're connected. You cannot change one without changing the other. So I can't come in here and say, hey, I'd like all this extra stuff in the project and not expect time and cost to be affected by that. So my job as a project manager, when somebody suggests change of scope, or I need something sooner, change of time, or I need you to cut the budget, change of cost, my job as a project manager is to tell them what the consequences of those choices are and let them pick the best option for them at that point in time.
Okay, all right.
Notice that we have another one in the middle there.
Quality.
Quality. So quality technically is defined as the degree to which we fulfill the scope. But we also think about quality in a couple of other ways. Project quality, how well did we run this project? We also think about process quality, how good are our processes to allow us to get this project done? So there's some other aspects of quality that sprinkle into this to allow us to either get this done more efficiently or not in some cases. So those are the factors that limit what our options are when we're looking at all of the different requirements. Writing good requirements is really essential to having a good project. It is the foundation of our project. If we don't have good requirements from the beginning, then we have no hope of having a good project, because we didn't originally state what needed to be done in the requirements.
So it sounds like the scope is kind of like the recipe in a cookbook. If we don't know the steps of how we're going to get to where we need to be, we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve.
That's exactly right. And so when we are gathering requirements, or actually what happens in a lot of cases is we short that process of gathering requirements. Oh, we've got enough, let's just go ahead and start doing stuff. Then that's a recipe for disaster, to use your analogy. All right, so project assumptions. Along with constraints, we also have assumptions. There's certain things that we either have to assume to be true or not true so we can move on. We can't labor on it. And so when we talk about assumptions, these are things that are in place that we are not sure about, but we have to assume one way or another so that we can continue planning. But they're sources of risk, and we're going to talk about how you can document and account for this later on. Anything that's part of a constraint or assumption is a source of risk to the project. A risk is an unknown. It's something we don't know. And if it's something that we don't know or we're not sure of, then it can go bad for us, and we need to think about that. And we need to think about how that's going to affect the triple constraint.
So these project assumptions, are these things that go into our scope statement?
Absolutely. As they come up, as these concerns usually come up, what we'll do is we'll document these in our scope statement, and then we'll revisit it later in the planning process when we look at risk. So once again, we're just documenting it so that we don't have to rehash over these over and over and over again, and we can move on and plan what we do know. Project objectives. So we stated earlier that we need to break the project out into objectives. So for instance, if I were building a building, then I would break it out probably into maybe the objective of the foundation, maybe the objective of putting the infrastructure together, maybe electrical and plumbing, and then finishing work. Those would probably be the main objectives, and there would be a lot of activities associated with each one of those objectives.
Okay.
But the goal is that the objectives, if they're all completed, then the project is completed.
Okay. All right.
When we're looking at objectives, we need to make sure that we break out our project into objectives that are all inclusive of all of those get done, then the whole project is done. No more, no less. All right. So now we have objectives. We break our project out into objectives. What maybe are a couple of objectives associated with your wireless network project?
Well, I guess one objective would be that we need wireless coverage within a certain area at certain points around the campus. Another objective would be that we need to have 2 wireless networks, one for public access and one for private access. Okay, so as you define what those objectives are, now you go through the process of fine-tuning what work needs to be done or what requirements associated with the work need to be gathered in order to get those objectives completed. So when you look at the scope definition process, we have to identify the requirements first, what is required in order for this to be successful. Then, how do those requirements associate with the major objectives? And then we pull that together in our scope statement, and then we make sure that both the customer, the project manager, the project team, that everybody involved with this signs off on that scope statement so that we all have a clear understanding of what we are and what we're not going to do on this project. Does that make sense? It does. So that's what keeps us from that scope creep. That's exactly right. When you're putting a scope statement together, remember that it's really important to verbalize it in a way that everybody can understand. So if I'm presenting this to the client, it should be in verbiage that the client understands. If, when we're pulling this together, that anytime somebody looks at this, that it's not, that it's unambiguous, they couldn't get 2 things out of this, that there's one clear-cut goal or objective or requirement associated with this. A lot of times people will do run-on requirements, that it's and, and we want one clear requirement for each requirement so that we can assign that to work to be done later on. And so everybody's on the same page and understands that they're on the same page.
That's right. And it's something that we will revisit. The scope statement, while we'll freeze it, so to speak, at the end of the planning period, we're going to try not to add anything to it through scope creep, but it's something that we'll come back to. Did we get this done? Did we do this the way we were supposed to? So it's something that we will revisit over and over again.
Okay.
Why is it important to put together a good scope statement? Well, we want to avoid these things. We want to avoid problems that happen quite frequently on projects where we have uncontrolled changes, where, everybody's suggesting, well, let's do this and this and this, and that's not what we originally planned to do. Or people don't understand exactly what we're doing. They're confused and they don't have direction on clear goals. We don't want overworked or underworked resources. We don't want everybody running around freaking out all the time. You can't sustain that type of environment for a long period of time. But we also don't want people standing around twiddling their thumbs, because in that case, they're going to go on to other projects and other things.
Right.
Also, we want to make sure that we're putting together and can defend the schedules and the budgets. So when we put together our requirements and then we put the work together, we're going to go through the process of putting a schedule and a budget together so that we can defend that and say, this is why it's going to cost this much, or this is why it's going to take that much time. If that's not okay, then you're going to have to cut scope, and let's talk about what your options are there. And then lastly, we want to set expectations. This whole process is about setting expectations with your project team, with your sponsor, with your customers, with everybody on what we are and what we're not going to do on the project. So thereby, when we're at the end of the project, nobody is surprised with the outcome. That everybody says, yes, that's what we plan to do, and yes, that's what got accomplished. So these common problems on a project are what we're trying to avoid, so that when we get to the end of the project, that there is no surprise on what we've done, that we've accomplished exactly what we said we were going to accomplish for the budget that we said and in the time frame that we said.
And I definitely don't want to have any dissatisfied customers or stakeholders.
That's right. We want to make sure that they're happy.
Okay, Christina, so as I start to pull my team together to work on this project, how do I assign roles to different people?
All right, so when you're pulling your team together, sometimes you get to choose who's on your team, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes they are just assigned to your team. So when we're gathering our project team, one of the things that we need to do is that we need to understand, first of all, what skill sets do we need, and then who has those skill sets and who's available. A lot of times when we are looking at a group of people, they may have specific skill sets within your organization, but they're not available at that point in time. They're working on other projects. So when we look at our project team, there's a couple of different types of teams. You may have somebody local, somebody within your organization that you're going to utilize, or you may have a virtual team. You may have people all over the place, maybe even in other parts of the world. Both options have their benefits and their negatives. Local, you know those individuals, but then you know those individuals, right? So you know the negatives of working with certain individuals that are close to you as well. You know what their skill sets are, but they might not have all the skill sets that you need. So that's the issues with local. With remote members in a virtual project team, then you have other issues. Maybe you have the option of finding the skill sets anywhere in the world, but then maybe you have cultural differences that you need to be aware of, and how, not just in how people speak, but also how they interact in a business environment, or how they treat managers or subordinates, etc.
Sure, and possible time zone issues, communication issues, you never know.
Absolutely. So those are some of the negatives. So both of them have positives and negatives, and we just have to make the decision on, what do we have available, and then maybe what do we need to supplement. Really, the world is your oyster. I mean, you can really pick from anybody in the world if you have the connections in order to find those resources. So when we're putting our skills together, one thing that you can can use is something that looks like this. This is called a skills matrix.
That looks complicated.
It's really not. Basically, all this is a matrix that says, hey, these are the skills that I need. This is the skill level for this particular project that we're working on. What kind of supervisory action do we need with this particular individual? Are they very well versed? They don't need a lot of supervision, or do they need a lot of supervision maybe because they're new at it and they'll need some guidance? What's the experience level, the education level perhaps in some, or maybe certifications in your case? What certifications do they have? And then who might be the ideal team member for the job? And then we would go through the process and say, are they available? And maybe what's our second choice, third choice, etc., depending on availability.
Okay, all right.
So basically what this helps us do is this helps us get our arms wrapped around what do we need, and then what would we like to have, and coming to the realization of, what is the availability of the resources for this particular project.
So I'm really starting with the skills that I need and then trying to find the right people, whether they're local or remote, to plug into those needs.
That's right. And I have to say a little thing associated with project management. A lot of times a project manager is compensated for the success of their project. But ultimately, a project manager should have the interest of the company in mind.
Sure.
When it comes to resources, if there is a higher priority project that needs resources that I would like to have more, then I, as a project manager, should bow to that and say, you know what, that's best for the organization because that's a higher priority project, rather than stomp my feet in the ground and pitch a fit because my project is more important than the greater good of the organization as a whole.
That makes sense. And I also tend to look at organizational development as well, and I try to get a mix of experienced team members and maybe some team members who are stretching beyond what they've done before, just to give them some new opportunities, some new experience, some new skills.
And cross-training. I mean,
Exactly.
that's a very important part. When we look at a team, it is a cornerstone, just like requirements are. It's a cornerstone of a good project. Pulling the right people together can make the project successful or not successful. So we need to make sure that we're very thoughtful in understanding what skills are needed and then getting the right people for the job. Sometimes you're going to have to fight for that, because those people typically are wanted by other project managers and maybe by their functional managers, depending on what type of organization we're working with. And then other times, you should give up that fight because they are being assigned to higher priority projects. So understanding the priority of your project versus other projects is really important. Good team members can make a project great, fun, exciting, interactive, and then having team members that are the opposite of that can really challenge your managerial skills as well. Ideally, what we want to keep in mind, Chip, when we're putting our team together is what's best for the organization.
That makes sense.